Welcome participants to this second of a series of GRDC webinars on weed-related topics. And this morning we've got Bill Gordon giving a presentation on spray application in summer fallows. I think it's very timely as we move into the summer period, and welcome to all the people that we've got on the webinar here this morning to listen to Bill. The format we'll use will be 30 minutes of presentation followed by time for questions, which will follow on. At this point in time, I'll hand over to Bill to move into the presentation.
Okay, just while we're advancing the slides, I'll give you a brief overview of some of the topics that we'll cover, and this will come up on the screen at the moment. I guess we want to look at some of the issues related to summer fallow spraying, and I guess some of the things that we'll be talking about is trying to get over the country to cover enough area while conditions are still good. This is particularly important when you think about things like double knocks and the need to come back within a reasonable time frame. The other things I'll talk about briefly are some of the risks associated with inversions over summer in relation to the label statements and warnings and the potential for drift. And then we'll move into looking at efficacy. Is it better at day versus night, or are there other things driving that? We'll consider things like target size and stubble load and what the product actually does when it hits the target, so in terms of translocation, and how they should influence our decision about droplet size and spray volume. And then want to look at some of the more recent effects we've been looking at with, I guess, the increase in spraying speed that we're seeing in a lot of areas. That combined with larger droplets, we're seeing more effects around the machine, particularly with deposition into standing stuff and in and around the wheel tracks. There'll be a range of issues that we try and cover off in today's presentation. So I just want to talk about that first point I mentioned, and that's in relation to conditions for spraying and inversions, and that the desire to increase capacity or get more hectares per hour can certainly give better results by getting the product under the target where it's more susceptible. But the other side of the equation, it can also increase the risk of drift simply by spraying more hectares per hour. If you're leaving product in the air, then you're creating more risk if you're spraying when the conditions are not right. And surface temperature inversions are one of those situations we need to be very careful about. Certainly labels in recent years of any new products or any products that have had a change in formulation or a change in loading are likely to have new statements on the label. And one of those warns against spraying during surface temperature inversions. Now, GRDC have put out some great publications to explain what can happen under inversion conditions. There's a weather book there called Weather Essentials for Herbicide Application. But there's also a fact sheet, which is the plain English version of what's on the APVMA website. So when they're talking about surface temperature inversions, they're actually suggesting to growers that you should anticipate that there will be a surface inversion every night between basically sunset and sunrise, unless you have one of the following three, which is that it's raining, there's heavy low-level cloud, or the wind speed remains above 11 kilometres an hour for the entire evening. It's that wind speed situation that I want to talk about, because the wind speed during the day is very different to the wind speed at night. During the day, while the sun's heating the ground, we tend to get turbulent flows, or the air mixes or rolls as it goes across the surface, and this tends to bring droplets back down towards the ground. Whereas when you're spraying at night and the ground's cooled, you tend to lose that turbulence and you get flows that are more laminar or parallel to the ground. And this becomes an issue because droplets that get trapped in the air tend to stay in the air at night and move much further distances. And to illustrate this, I just want to run through the results of a trial that was conducted a couple of summers ago in Millie, which is situated between sort of Moree and Narrabri, just north of the Ladder. And we had two spraying times, one at 2:30 in the morning and the other one at about 7:30 in the morning, just after the sun had come up about 20 degrees above the horizon and the ground starting to warm. And in this trial, we've sprayed a 55 hectare block with a standard 36 metre boom at about 22 kilometres an hour, and we're using low pressure air inductions, the TJET AIX-R02s at 4 bar, which is at the smaller end of course at 50 litres per hectare. And what we did was take samples of what was depositing in the paddock and also deposition on the ground for several hundred metres downwind. But the other thing we had in this trial was a 20 metre tower up in the air to catch the airborne fraction, or to try and measure how much chemical was staying in the air. And so this was 20 metres high, located 80 metres downwind of the paddock. What I'll show you in the next couple of slides is what we were actually catching as the airborne fraction in night versus day spraying. So our night situation again was 2:30 in the morning. Day was about 7:30 just after sunrise. The wind speed at night was 11.6 kilometres, whereas the daytime was 18. And what we were trying to do was match the temperature and humidity so that our droplet survival was as even as possible between the two trials. And if we just look at the fraction of product that was remaining airborne 80 metres downwind from the edge of the sprayed paddock, you can see that the daytime spraying left about 0.3% of the applied rate in the air. The night time was 1.6. So that's a 5 to 6-fold increase in the amount of chemical that was remaining airborne at night. And the next slide, we're going to show what that distribution of spray through that vertical profile in the air actually looked like when we compare the daytime versus the nighttime situation. So this is a measure on this graph at height above the ground on that tower that was located 80 metres downwind up to about 20 metres. And these are comparing the percentages of amounts of product that we're actually depositing on the string. And the blue bars represent the daytime spraying. We see reasonably low amounts there up to about 6 or 7 metres. And then we have this little tuft of spray up there, which is probably from the wake effect or the air, the suction up behind the sprayer, lifting droplets into that inversion that would break from the ground upwards in the morning. So even at 7:30, the inversion hadn't fully broken. But when we compare that to the nighttime deposits, which are the red bars, you can see that we've got much greater amounts of chemical remaining in the air, and that air is actually moving more parallel to the ground at about 11 kilometres an hour. So in this particular trial, when we compared the daytime to the nighttime, not only was the amount in the air greatly increased, but during the day, most of that airborne fraction had settled out within about 400 metres downwind, and that's due to the rolling effect of the air across the surface bringing the droplets down. Whereas at night, we didn't get any deposition on the ground after about 100 metres, so what was in the air was staying in the air. And this is travelling at 11 kilometres per hour, or just over 11 kilometres per hour. So in the 3 to 4 hours before sunrise, that could travel 30 or 40 kilometres. So nighttime spraying is much greater risk from a drift point of view. I guess in following slides we'll explore whether there's an improvement in efficacy. So the question of night spraying versus day spraying, we're all aware that temperature and humidity are always better. But I always have the question about, is the efficacy better? And I guess that's always going to depend on the condition of the target and the rate of product predominantly. And this is an example of one trial of day versus night spraying that was conducted in WA, New York. We did a series of these trials just comparing 40 litres per hectare versus 60 litres per hectare with standard commercial tank mixes, but what we've done is run them at slightly lower rates and pick up if there are differences. So the group of 3 bars on the left-hand side, which I'm trying to show with my arrow, were applied at 40 litres. The 3 bars on the right were applied at 60 litres with the nozzle types down the bottom. So they're all coarse or slightly larger than coarse. The dark coloured bars were the nighttime application and the light coloured bars were the daytime application. And this is on a single species paddy melon. So you can see that at the lower volume we actually probably got a slightly better response from daytime spraying to nighttime spraying. But this actually reverses depending on the species you get. The main effect that we saw across all trials was this increase in efficacy in jumping from 40 litres to 60 litres. And that was consistent across a lot. And I'll go to the next slide. This is comparing, say, an early morning application versus the late afternoon application. So we're looking at the hours of daylight after spraying. There's 3 species there: weed, melon, and kerosene grass in the various colours. And the graph on the left is the daytime results, the one on the right is the nighttime results. And I know it's very, very busy with the different volumes going on and different nozzle types. But the key message there was that in this instance the weeds weren't stressed and the efficacy was very, very similar. So this data will be available later if people want to go back through it. But I'm just trying to, I guess, emphasise that the condition of the target is really important when it comes to determining whether you're going to get efficacy or not. This particular graph's looking at a similar situation. We've got paddy melon and toad rush, a very narrow, fine target versus a large broadleaf. And again, similar tank mixes. The 3 bars on the left are at 40 litres in each graph, the 3 on the right at 60 litres, and the left graph is the daytime, the right graph is the night time. But it was also applied a couple of weeks later after a rainfall event, so we're looking at the effect of freshening up the weeds. And it's interesting when you look at it, I guess, if we looked at the first application made during the day, we did get a response from the toad rush looked better during the day, but not necessarily better at night. But the biggest response in that first graph again was to a volume effect, and similar in the second one. But I guess my take-home message from this graph is that some weeds will benefit from waiting for a freshen up. Others, it probably doesn't make a lot of difference. But again, the biggest impact is probably application volume if you've got the rate of product right and the timing right. So this takes me to the next part of our graph. This is a daytime application, a trial done in South Australia in 2012. We're looking at 2 different tank mixes. One is using spray seed to desiccate heliotrope. The other one is with a glyphosate mix using phenoxys in there, so 2,4-D and Garlon in there as well as oils. And I know there's a lot of data there, but I guess my simple message, if we look at a contact type product like spray seed, and we've got a range of nozzle types here and spray qualities as demonstrated, and at 60 litres per hectare we didn't see a lot of difference between the medium and coarse, but when we went to a larger droplet size we saw a reduction in efficacy, and that's indicated by the red bar. When we moved to a higher volume, even the larger droplets tended to work. So, you know, with a contact type product, coverage is going to be obviously a key driver in this circumstance. With the glyphosate mixes, probably not as effective on this weed for desiccation, but we actually got a pretty good response at the lower volume, and we actually saw poorer results at the higher volume. And that can occur with products like glyphosate, particularly if there's issues with water quality, but it's to do with the concentration of the droplet. And you may note in this trial I put a note up the top that the delta T was 14.5 to 15.5, which we considered extreme for spray. But that's as measured in the air. You can see an example of the weeds, and the ground cover there was quite substantial. There was good soil moisture and ground cover, and when you measure the delta T down at the target, it's a lot better than what it is in the air sometimes. So it also always encouraged people to have a look at what's going on at the target. Because if these plants are actively transpiring, the humidity is actually going to be better or higher down at the target than it may be in the air sometimes. So some of the things I think we should consider for summer fallow spraying, when we consider the time of day, it's going to be important for drift. Maybe some effects on species in terms of their freshness, but I always think the main drivers of efficacy are going to be, you know, timing, condition of the target, rate of product, but also considering what the product does when it hits the target, and that comes back to the coverage requirements. So just a quick reminder for some people that we have 2 ways of transporting products within the plant. We have the xylem, which will take water and nutrients from the soil upwards and outwards. We also have the phloem that will move, say, sugars and the photosynthesis downwards. And if you get a product that moves in both systems well, then you've got something that's really flexible, because you don't have to have absolute coverage. But if you get something that doesn't translocate well, then you need to consider those coverage requirements, which comes back to droplet size and volume. And I'll just move to the next slide as a couple of examples. This is a table that's been summarised from one of the GRDC fact sheets looking at in-crop herbicide use. So we've got our herbicides over on the left, and then some examples of products that you're probably familiar with, and some notes on uptake and translocation. And the one point I want to sort of make about this target is that there are a group of products that are phloem and xylem transported. That means they can move up and down in the plant. However, there's really only 3 groups that have that flexibility. Your Group B herbicides, so you know some of these examples here. And if I go to the next slide, the other 2 groups include your Group I's, which are your phenoxys, and your Group M's. All the others are either going to have limited translocation or perhaps upward. And that means there's a lot of products that have higher coverage requirements. And I guess it's understanding that translocation when we're going out to spray that actually should dictate our droplet size and volume. So this next table is a summary, I guess, of the sorts of volume ranges and spray quality I think are required to do most summer fallow jobs, and really thinking about what jobs are you doing and what nozzles should you actually have in your tool kit. So in a lot of areas, most growers will probably operate a couple of ranges of volume. They may have a lower range and a higher range. Now that lower range may vary from anywhere from 50 to 60 litres up to about 70 to 80, depending on the stubble load. So when we're thinking about summer fallow products, like our fully translocated products like glyphosate, MCPA, 2,4-D, those types, a lot of label requirements will actually require a coarse spray quality, and so typically that would be done at a lower application volume. So in some instances, you will see that in a low stubble environment, some of our growers will be operating in the 50 to 60 litre range, whereas in some of the southern systems or higher stubble loads, they may actually have to push that volume up quite a bit. On the other side of the equation, you may be looking at more contact type products like a paraquat, but also thinking about the poorly translocated products. So if you happen to be using a group A where it's legally able to be used in fallow, then you're going to be looking at typically higher application volumes, but also a slightly smaller droplet size to get better coverage on the plant. So quite often this will require a different nozzle type. If you're lucky, you may get one if you go from, say, 60 litres coarse up to about 80 litres medium. The same nozzle may do it, or a jump from, say, 80 to 100. But in some circumstances, depending on your speed, you may not be able to do that with a single nozzle. It may actually require a couple of different types. So normally for most guys, I'd say it's useful to have a nozzle that stays fairly coarse across its range, and you can use that for fallow and perhaps take it into pre-ems or soil applied products, even if you're using those in summer. But it's also very useful to have a nozzle that's legally coarse that can be used to increase the pressure and volume and actually get back towards medium where the label allows that. So in most situations, it probably requires at least two types to get through your fallow, but one of those may also be very useful in winter spraying. In some areas, I'll just mention this over here, where we do have a lot of summer cropping, where there may be broadleaf crops, cotton, horticulture, sunflowers, those types of things being grown. You know, when using some of those products that can cause damage to them, such as your phenoxies, it may be useful even considering a larger droplet size to cut down that drift. There's a lot of people in the northern region that will use nozzles like TTIs, which are extremely coarse, for that sort of fallow spraying situation where they may have sensitive crops around. And I guess what I want to talk about next is that push to larger droplets in a desire to control drift and cut down loss and maybe be able to spray slightly hotter conditions, does with some trade-offs, and they're really quite critical. One of the things that we've seen in recent years is the effect of higher travel speeds combined with larger droplets has some effects we may not have seen before. And I guess the example I've got here is that if I'm travelling forwards in this direction and I'm exceeding 20 kilometres an hour, that most of those low pressure air inductions only push the droplets down at about 20 kilometres an hour. That droplet movement is always going to be in a forward direction. And this can create a couple of issues. You can get more interception on one side of the plant. And there's an example down here at the bottom of a thistle that was sprayed at 33 kilometres an hour with an almost very coarse spray quality. Now the plant must have been stressed when it was sprayed, but it's only actually burnt off one side. And you can tell this is a droplet size effect out in the paddock because you see different sides of the plant hit with each run up and down the paddock. If smaller droplet size, you might see that sort of effect with a wind, but when we push to larger droplets and larger travel speeds, that's one of the issues we come across. We're also seeing, when you move to the large end of coarse droplets or in a very coarse, extremely coarse, increased shadowing behind stubble. And this is particularly a problem with, say, grasses that might emerge in the stubble or plant line over summer. They're very hard to control. The other two effects of speed that most people will be aware of is the dust and wheel trimming issue. But also with increased speed, you tend to leave more product in the air. So there's a whole heap of effects that actually go on there. And I just want to talk about this deposition side of things and how it relates to efficacy and some of the things that are happening around the machine. And the first thing is just looking at the effect of ground clearance. So the photograph on the right is actually done by a trailing rig or a tow behind. And they're travelling at higher speed, and in that example it's travelling into a headwind. So you've got a large area right across the centre of the machine that's gotten position. And that'll tend to turn up every second set of wheel tracks when you've got a headwind, tailwind situation, when you've got a trailing rig or a low clearance machine. The photograph on the left is actually done with a high clearance self-propelled, and the wind's actually coming slightly from right to left. And so you see a downwind effect and sometimes an effect slightly around the centre. But usually your higher clearance machines are a little bit better on the wheel tracks, but you get this wake effect or downwind effect that needs to be considered when you're setting up the machine. And so in a crosswind, the high clearance machines tend to give poorer deposition on the downwind side, but also some problems in the centre if you're travelling very fast. I guess by very fast, I'm thinking in the mid to high 20s or faster. So the next series of slides are just trying to illustrate from a deposit point of view what happens to some of those droplets around the machine. And hopefully advance for me to the next one. So in this picture, we're looking at some water-sensitive paper or cards that have been placed out in the paddock. This particular slide is showing deposition in two positions in the paddock. So the top row here is looking at deposition in the inter-row at various points across the machine. And the bottom row is actually looking at deposition within the standing stubble, so in behind or the standing stubble. So in this instance, its travel speed was 22 kilometres an hour, 60 litres per hectare. We were operating at 4 bar, so at a small end of course with the nozzle we used. And this first slide that I've got the red box around is what's happening out on the boom. And so in the inter-row, and in behind the stubble, it's actually looking pretty good at that droplet size. And with a slight crosswind, you usually get the best deposition in the stubble you can. And then as I move across the machine, we're going left boom to outside the left wheel, then inside the left wheel, so in between the rows and down the bottom there behind the stubble. And when you get to the center of the machine, you can actually see a bit of a drop-off in deposition. And this is very common with most machines. Typically with self-propelled, it starts occurring in those high teens, low 20s in kilometres per hour. The other effect we can see here is the displacement of droplets around the wheels. So inside and outside of the right wheel on this particular machine, we're actually seeing quite a change. And then there's a drop-off in deposition down there on the outside of the right wheel. Now the next slide I'm going to go to is actually a fairly big jump in speed with the same machine. So we've actually jumped it up to 30 kilometres per hour. And it's this area here that I wanted to point out, and that's in and around the wheels. This tends to extend out for about a metre or a metre and a half downwind from the machine, particularly in the standing stubble. We've got very poor deposition. And so one of the things that can be done if you're using a knockdown or non-residual product that doesn't have plant back issues is obviously to increase the flow on the wheel track. Now most people will use wheel track nozzles, in other words a large nozzle or a twin nozzle directly on the wheel. But I think when people are travelling in the high 20s, low 30s, they actually need to increase that flow further out, not just from the wheel but a little bit wider. And I'll try and go to the next slide. Another way of doing that is running, say, a narrow directly adjacent to the wheels. And that can be really useful when you're also using, say, residual products or in-crop, rather than having increased flow on the wheels, but having something like a 10-inch or a 25 centimetre spacing instead of a 50 centimetre spacing. So this is 26 kilometres an hour, 80 litres per hectare, and you can see that across the machine, even though we've got an increase in speed, we've got pretty good deposition. And in a lot of areas, it's definitely improved by having narrow spacing. And what I'll do in the next couple of slides is just try and put some numbers on that. So what I'm showing here is if you took a measurement of what was landing on those cards in terms of the area covered, here's an example where we've sprayed at 18 kilometres an hour. This is with a broadacre self-propelled, 60 litres per hectare, standard 50 centimetre spacing, but we're operating at the small end of course. And down the bottom here, this is what's going on out in the boom. Even with a slight crosswind from left to right, this is the position in the interrow. This is the deposition behind the stubble. So this is what's occurring across most of the boom. You can see the same thing on the right-hand side. Then we go outside of the left wheel, inside the left wheel, centre of the machine, and I'd say, look, that's actually pretty good deposition across the machine. 18 kilometres an hour is a very reasonable travel speed for most spraying. And we tend to see that 10, 20, 30% drop-off in deposition in the stubble compared to the interrow. If that's an area where you're having problems, it's a good place to be looking at what's going on. When I take that speed up to 26 kilometres per hour, and we go on to a 25 centimetre spacing, which normally improves things at the same volume, can you see that drop-off? In most areas across the boom, there's a much larger drop in deposition between the interrow and behind the stubble, so every second slide is what's going on in the stubble. And it's not because of this travel speed, it's actually because of the drop in pressure from going from the small end of course to the big end of course, which has given us about a a threefold reduction in the number of droplets produced. So in the next slide, I've taken that up to 31 kilometres an hour, and you can see that it's actually evened out the deposition because we've got the pressure back up and operating at the small end of course. But what it's done is really increased that effect around the wheel tracks. And so if I looked at what can improve the deposition around the wheel tracks, high clearance machines tend to be better than your trailing or low clearance machines. Look, front-mounted booms do a really good job and are much more even than rear-mounted booms up to about 22 kilometres an hour. Then when you start exceeding those speeds, even your tyres on the front will push air forwards and push droplets out. So even front-mounted booms tend to need wheel track nozzles. And so for the knockdown products, I definitely increase the flow on the wheel. But if I was travelling in the mid to high 20s or faster, I'd actually be increasing the flow a little wider, and I'd also consider using a narrower spacing around the wheels. So even if you're not plumbing the whole boom that way, put some additional nozzles in between if you're running 50 centimetre to 25 centimetre spacing adjacent to the wheel, so you can put a bit more flow either side. And in some situations, that probably means using higher application volumes. Certainly at 25 centimetre spacing, if most people are only using a lilac or an 025 now, if you narrow up the spacing, that means you're coming back to 1 or 1.5 orifices there, which is not going to suit everyone. Whereas if you're at a speed and volume where you're already using an 03, it's quite possible to select some 015 air inductions to put in there and get a very similar flow rate but a much more even application. The next point I put there is obviously slower travel speeds will always improve that, but we're still pushing against that getting over the country in a reasonable amount of time. So if you're travelling at higher speeds to get over country, then some of these things are going to be more important that I've just previously mentioned. And one of the things we've seen, although I haven't run enough trials on it yet, is just the effect of having guards over the wheel. Something that the more guard you have around the wheel tends to show the less air they displace and the better that becomes. And a lot of growers I'm dealing with that said that split tread patterns on tyres also reduce that airflow and improve the wheel tracks. In terms of deposition in the stubble, which is the majority of the machine, a crosswind is always the biggest factor about it. We always get better deposition in standing stubble with a slight crosswind than you will with a head or tailwind. I think that operating nozzles at the smaller end of the coarse spectrum towards medium is probably about the best droplet size for getting deposition and enough droplet numbers down there. Again, narrow spacings do improve that, but it's got to suit your machine, your volume, your speed. If you go too small an orifice, you'll have problems with droplet size, filtration, and things like that. And in many instances, one of the best solutions is going to be slightly higher water rates, so they do even things out a lot. And the normal things like getting the boom height right double overlap above the target, and things like slower travel speeds. So I've probably just covered a whole heap of ground in that time, but I guess my take-home messages from this short few-minute segment are that if you're considering spraying at night, it can be a very high-risk proposition from a drift point of view. If you've only got 3 or 4 kilometres of airspeed at night, that's not enough to mix and bring droplets back down. But for each hour you spray, if the wind's doing 3 or 4 kilometres an hour, that's how far it will travel in that time. And you need to think about how many hours you've got before sunrise and the inversion breaks. Because if that's 3 or 4 hours and you've got 3 to 4 kilometres of wind speed, you're looking at moving 12 to 15 kilometres before it even gets a chance to come down. The second thing I'd say is that efficacy or control in the paddock is always going to be affected by the target condition or stress. So the fresher the weeds, generally the better the uptake of the product will be. But also the rate of product and application volume are probably the biggest drivers more than the time of day. And that's provided the droplet size is appropriate and will survive. And I think, when you're thinking about what volume and droplet size you should use, it's got to match the product's mode of action, so have a good understanding of how it translocates, but also think about where the target is, and if you've got a higher stubble load, then anything between the nozzle and the weed that's trying to hit like stubble is going to intercept droplets. And the only way to compensate for that is for a little bit more water volume to get more droplets down there. And the last thing is that the highest spraying speeds that we've seen in recent years are starting to create some new problems, not just field tracks, but particularly just outside of it. So some of the common things I'd say, if you're doing a double knock, always drive in the opposite direction each time. Move across a set of planter width or something so you're not driving on the same wheel tracks each time. And obviously thinking about what the deposition is doing or where the droplets are landing in your paddock. And I'd encourage people to use something like water-sensitive paper. You can put them on blocks. Sit them out in between your machine around the wheel tracks and have a look for yourself at the effect of your droplet size and speed and what's going on. So having said all that, I might hand back to our organisers and see what questions would like to come in. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I think you've done a great job in covering a number of key important topics in a relatively short amount of time. And as Bill mentioned, there's a lot of information there in some of those slides. We have been recording this video, and that will be uploaded in the coming days onto the GRDC website, and all of the participants in this conference call will be sent the link to that video, and then also we'll have the slides available as well. There's also a number of GRDC publications and fact sheets on spray application, large number of those which have been written by Bill, and we'll also send out the links to